He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 25 years of experience. Together, we're the Brief Brothers, having an ongoing conversation about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. We're back for another episode, Henry, and today we have Cameron Day. And that name is probably familiar to a lot of our viewers and listeners because he is the son of the Shy It Day founder, Guy Day, who passed away a number of years ago. And he's written a new book, which is getting a lot of publicity, a lot of chatter. And we're going to talk about it today. It's called Chew with Your Mind Open. And the subtitle is The Advertising Survival Guide, Stage 1, Launch and Ascent. And Stage 1 is the clue that there are going to be at least one more volume. So Cameron is here to join us in a great conversation. Let's listen in.
Let's.
All right, Henry, we're back with another episode, and today we are graced with the presence of Cameron Day, who is the author of an amazing and an insightful new book, and he'll tell us that this is not going to be his last book. He'll have more to say about that. It's called Chew with Your Mind Open, and it is a primer for young copywriters and art directors trying to get into the business, among other things. Plus, you may recognize the name Day, which I think Cameron will tell us a little bit more about. So, Cameron, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Brief Brothers.
Well, thanks so much, guys. So first, I should start by saying I'm probably the least qualified person you've ever talked to about the subject of briefs, because I am not technically a planner and I do not write many briefs. But I've had an involvement in refining many a brief in my day. And as a freelancer, I've got a couple of little tricks up my sleeve that I've often do that have really helped me embrace a brand as I'm starting to write about it. And that's kind of like my own kind of ninja way of doing a brief. And that's that I always try to write a manifesto, even if it's not asked for. I will study the brief I'm sent, and then I'll try to write a manifesto, the most creative expression that I can, because I think it starts to develop a voice. And oftentimes I find myself writing a theme line or two within that exploration. I think it just gives me an excuse to start writing.
Yep, a good springboard. You know, it's interesting you mentioned being a freelancer, and I often advise people, it's not my main line of work in terms of doing workshops, but I occasionally teach workshops on brief writing. And I always say, imagine that you're writing this for a freelancer. You can't assume that they know all the ins and outs of your client and the client's business. I mean, you have to always make sure that you have it at a level that somebody who's never touched this piece of business or this category before can understand what's going on. And I think that's a good filter for brief writers, because there's a lot of talented freelancers out there, but they're just not going to come in with all this experience that your agency creatives might have regarding the client and the category.
Well, I think that's an excellent piece of advice right there.
So I want to ask you about that chapter you wrote in your book on creative briefs. You said that you thought that the creative brief was a guess. You qualified that by saying, well, it's an educated guess, but it's still a guess. I found that I think my sense is that the brief is more than just a guess. Okay. And I've got examples, which you'll see when you get into the books that I've sent you, my books. I have examples of great briefs that I think are more than guesses. In other words, Henry and I have talked about this a lot when we say that, he as a brief writer. See, I'm a former creative and he's a planner. So he has never been averse to seeing work that's come back from his creative teams that didn't directly address the brief because they had this huge, great idea. Right. And Henry's been always willing to pivot and say, well, wait a minute, that's a great idea. Let's adjust the brief rather than shoot down an idea. So it seems to me that even though there is, and I like your term we discussed just before we started recording, that the brief is malleable. I like to say it's organic. it grows and evolves with the process.
Yep.
I guess I was just a little off put by the term guess, because I think it's more than that. Do you want to expand on that, or you want
to? One, I'd be happy to. I certainly didn't mean to offend anybody when I used that term. But I think part of that too is probably that I've worked in a lot of smaller agencies where planners didn't have quite as much of experience. And once in a great while, you get a brief where a client has loaded it up with everything that they want to express in this ad, right? And a planner has diligently condensed it down to a 46-page brief. And I say that kiddingly, but they have kind of loaded it all in there, and basically the client wouldn't approve it without loading all those items in it. So then when the brief comes to you, I always find that oftentimes within that brief there is a nugget, and you sometimes need to dig a little bit more. So the planners that I've always had the best time working with, and it sounds like Henry is this kind of planner, is if I'm stuck on a brief, I can go sit with them and say, hey, I'm really stuck on this, and let's talk about it a little bit. And oftentimes I find I can pull a support point for the brief and say, well, I really think there might be something in that. And my experience is the better planner will tell me, well, then chase that, or let's sit and talk about that. Because within the brief, I think the answer is almost always somewhere in the brief, but sometimes it hasn't been unearthed. And I would also say to you that I've had the pleasure of working to some very good planners, and I don't think I would call their briefs a guess, but I think when I say educated guess, I feel like a brief is hypothetical. It's nearly always written by somebody who's intelligent, has written briefs before, but it doesn't always get to that actionable idea to where you can tell that idea to 10 creatives and they're all going to be able to bring you stuff.
Yeah. So I read the chapter and I wasn't off put by it because first of all, I think we need to distinguish within a brief. I think there are things that we could identify as definitely not being a guess, right? Like, so the consumer, like the target audience, right, that's usually the function of reducing down a bunch of research, qualitative, quantitative. We're pretty sure about the target audience when whether you can write it up in a way that the creators are empathetic to the target, and that's a different question, but it's not a guess. I think that a single-minded proposition, just by virtue of the fact that sometimes we have multiple possible single-minded propositions floating around in our head, tells you that it's not an exact science and it is more of a guess. We're trying to intuit which of these single-minded propositions is the most motivating, creative, that would have the most legs, the most inspiring. So I think there is a fair amount of guesswork, but like anything, like being a doctor, right? Like you see different disease conditions and you're ruling out certain things, but you're not 100% sure, but there's never 100% certainty for sure, but the more experience you have, the more skill you have, you can whittle things down. The other thing I'll say, and I agree with you, is I think when you have we always talk about, brief writers always talk about, it's called a brief, not a long, right? It's about the art of reductionism, right? That sure, what you're saying is true. When you have this 46-page brief, there's something in there that certainly could lead to something. I think our goal as brief writers should be so it's not hidden away in 46 pages that have to be, excavated out, but rather that within one or two possible concepts or ideas that might be introduced in the brief, that somehow it shines out and it stands out what needs to be done. So I would think that would be a best practice, is keeping it short. I would hate for people to write a long brief thinking the more shit they throw in there, the more chance that there might be some nugget that you guys would latch onto. I think it's better when you identify those nuggets in advance, whether they be in the target description, in the insight, or the single-minded proposition, and bring those to the fore so that there's not all that hunting and excavating going on.
Well, it's really remarkable how little really is written on the subject of developing briefs, right? And reading your book made me realize that, and it also made me think about some of the planners I've worked with in the past. I had one planner I worked with at Saatchi & Saatchi, and I'm sure you guys probably think this way already, but when she said it to me, it made so much sense. She said, when I write a brief, I always want to leave a small cognitive gap for the consumer to bridge. She said, I believe the best briefs leave that room for the consumer to have to do a little bit of math.
Yeah, one of my creative directors said something that Henry and I talk about this a lot. The goal of good creative is to draw the circle but not complete it. Trust the audience to figure it out.
Yeah.
And so a brief writer saying the same thing, that makes a lot of sense to me.
And we see a lot of great ads. The ones that are sticky are the ones that make you say, what is that? And they go, oh, like there's like almost like an inside, it's like being part of the inside joke. And if you're in on it, then you somehow just establish a bond with that ad and therefore the brand that's being advertised. We've also seen it backfire. I think Howard and I had a recent example. We do, when we don't have a guest, we'll do a creative review, or we'll review creative that we see in communication arts or in Ad Age, and we'll talk about it. And this particular was out of home for Heinz. And they basically took like a burger and put it in the shape of like that Heinz Keystone, like the silhouette of their logo. They did it with fries, and they did it with other things. And it was one of those, I got it instantly, and Howard didn't get it. And then I posted it on Facebook, where most of my friends are not in the ad business. And I said, do you recognize this brand? And there was no other brand ID and nobody got it. The only people that got it were connected to the business.
Yeah. In fact, I posted that on my LinkedIn feed, and I've checked it just today, and it's had over 13,000 views. One of the biggest. I'm not a big wig on LinkedIn. So 13, anything over 200 or 300 views for me is like awesome. This is like 13,000, and people are commenting on this left and right. And there is a divide. People who are in the business got it most of the time. And even some of the people in the business who got it said, yeah, but that's a long walk for a short drink. And then when they'd say, I canvassed my wife or my kids or my colleagues, they didn't get it. There was a huge divide. And my thinking was, this is an example of advertisers talking to themselves.
Well, if I might throw another example at you, because I'd love to know what your reaction was to that. Are you guys familiar with the Moldy Whopper?
Yes.
I would be most curious what your reaction is, because I had a very strong reaction to it.
I didn't like it.
So I'll preface this by saying I once worked on the Burger King account, and I follow Burger King very closely because I worked on it, and because in recent years they've done a lot of outstanding creative. There's a method to the madness that Machado, the CMO, former CMO, which is to generate a lot of earned media for very little capital investment. And that goes back all the way to the Proud Whopper, which, was a regular Whopper with a wrapper in a rainbow flag. It said, we're all the same inside, all the way through all kinds of things that Burger King did under Machado. So I think when your strategy is to do big, outrageous things that get noticed and get you earned media, there are going to be some that are great, and there are going to be some that may be not so great. I think a lot of the Burger King work, or that specific Burger King work, I think required you to do some work, right? Like why is Burger King putting this Moldy Whopper up there? And if you investigated it for half a second, you would find exactly that the reason is because they're talking about lack of preservatives in the burger. What you would expect is that the burger would deteriorate over time if it wasn't, full of artificial preservatives. They can get it. They've gotten into trouble. They've gotten into areas where people maybe didn't get what they were doing, but that's the risk that you run when you're running a very low budget, trying to get high impact on a low budget.
And to your point, 3 guys are now talking about it to your entire audience, who half of them could have thought it was great and half of them could have thought it was suck, but look, we're talking about it. I didn't I thought that it won huge awards, right? there's no contesting. So when you say there are ads that sometimes feel like they were ads made to win ads, and I really, as a creative person, wouldn't want to be attached to a whole lot of work like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then compare that to, did you ever see what Crispin did? This is several years back for mac and cheese, when Kraft said, you know what, we're going to reformulate our Kraft macaroni and cheese because there are preservatives in it, and we know we can do a better job and probably do it all with all natural ingredients. What Crispin said to them, and I thought this was, I wasn't there, so this is third party. They basically said, well, how about if you do this? How about if you release the Kraft macaroni and cheese and you don't tell anybody you've reformulated it, and then you wait 3 months to where nobody's had any complaints, and then you go, oh, by the way, 3 months ago we changed to all natural ingredients. So, which I thought was,
Yeah.
It didn't win awards like Moldy Whopper, but I thought, oh my, if that's not one of the greatest ideas I've ever heard, what is?
It definitely was one. I definitely remember that one, and I agree, it was great. The whole proposition was, I think the brilliance of that was, they recognized that this is kind of a staple of comfort food, and they didn't want to have like a Coca-Cola situation. It's like, why are you messing with it if it's fine the way it is? People have been eating it for a long time. And to your point, they said, well, this product actually tastes better, or at least as good as the one with the preservatives in it. So I said, well, let's pull a fast one on people. Let's switch the product, and then we'll tell them that we did it after, and that'll be the endorsement of, hey, you've been liking it for 3 months.
Right.
And by the way, you're always telling us that you want stuff that's more natural, less preservatives, and here it is, and it didn't damage the taste of because there's also, I think the insight is, most people have in their mind this compromise between things that maybe taste great and are guilty, but you feel guilty about because they're probably not that good for you, right?
Cameron, I want to get back to your book here because I wanted to go back to that chapter on briefs. Even though I was a little, had an odd reaction to your choice of the word guess, what I really admired about your attitude toward creative briefs in that chapter, but also throughout the book, is the respect that you have for the brief. I've encountered so many creatives who become jaded and cynical, and simply treat the brief as, oh yeah, another creative brief. It's going to be sucky. I can't stand it. Everybody loves to beat up on the brief. You don't. You all, from beginning to end, even when you just mention in passing, honor the brief, study the brief, go back to the brief. It's part of your work ethic. Where did that come from? Talk more about that. That's great.
Well, I think a lot of it came from having a father who understood what I was getting into, who realized the value of building bridges instead of burning them. And also, Shia Day had a good planning discipline. I think he's a believer in planning and a believer in digging for insights. So he trained me not to sit around bad-mouthing the brief. If you've got a problem with the brief, go close the door and have a conversation with the person who wrote it and explain to them the problem you're having. And there's every chance they'll empathize with you. Whereas if you're walking up and down the hall calling it a piece of shit, boy, you're just asking for it.
Yeah, I recall. I think it was at a CAN meeting several years ago. There was a presentation about the brief, and it made the ad week. And I saw the slide. It was said "fuck the brief," but obviously F-bomb the brief. Yeah. And I didn't see the whole presentation, but you knew what it was about.
Well,
are you familiar with that? Did you hear that story?
I haven't, but that's disappointing to hear.
Yeah. Well, you haven't missed anything. But anyway, I'm sure. Henry, are you familiar with that story?
I think you've told it to me before. I think also we talked right at the beginning about being a freelancer, and maybe some of it comes from that, right? Like when you're a freelancer, your only real connection to the project and to the assignment is the brief, right? So somehow that becomes, if you've doing freelance a long time, I think the brief becomes much more important to you than if you're a staff creative working on a retainer account where you think you know it all already, or you have access to the strategist or the account people at all times. I think when you're a freelancer, that document becomes, you mentioned a bridge, it becomes your bridge, literally, and your lifeline to completing the assignment. So that might have something to do with it as well.
I have a art director I work with in Atlanta quite a bit. Interestingly, we've only met face to face once in our lives, and we've worked together for 5 years. I mean, on hundreds of accounts. And he and I can get briefed from different locations and listen to the briefing and mark things about the brief that we have questions about. And so many times we both come back to, we circled the same thing on the brief as we were taking through it, and have actually successfully retooled the brief and then done the creative, and then turned in the creative. And I think the agency was like, "Well, how did you get here?" And we said, "Well, dirty little secret, we retooled the brief. We didn't tell you because we didn't want to piss you off." But I think Guy Kirkland and I have the ability to just have a nose for it because we've been doing it a long time. And we had one brief where the agency we were working for, when they took us to the brief, we got off the phone, I called Guy and I said, I circled something on the brief, and I told him what it was, and he said, I circled the same thing. And what was said within the brief as a support point is the client has a credibility problem. Mm. And we thought, well, if the client has a credibility problem, don't we have to go after that first before we start really doing responsible messaging? And what ended up happening was when we turned in the work and we wrote a mantra, and they were kind of leading us towards humor, right? And we wrote a brief, and we didn't write it against a humorous idea. We wrote it against something that we felt was a truth about it. And when we presented the brief or the mantra, I think the agency kind of sat back on their heels and said, that's really interesting what you did. And then we showed them creative that was humorous. But the brief, but the mantra was humorous. The mantra was very human.
You gave that example in the book. You talk about us for a ticket lawyer, right?
Right.
And the credibility being, well, how do these lawyers get you off? You know, and so you came out. I think the tagline was, I read it right before so I'm fresh in my mind. You have the right to remain ticketless, but which I think has a bit of humor to it, right? But it's not. It when you have a ticket, it's a problem, and you don't want to have that problem. So this is like a really credible way of explaining to people how the client worked. So it's a great example, by the way, in the book.
I wanted to say what the mantra said in it is, everybody's human, and as human beings, we all make mistakes.
Yeah.
It's a company that understands that and has found a way. So it came through this kind of this very human truth rather than, who are these? Are these a bunch of gangsters? Or, I mean, it's just
ambulance chasers. Like lawyers already begin with kind of a negative reputation. And then you throw in, like, you know, the bureaucracy of traffic ticket court and all of that. And it's like, who are these guys? And so I thought you found a very human way of breaking down the problem so that, you know, if you're faced with that issue of having a ticket, it feels like a much more plausible solution than some just joke, right? That's intended to just grab your attention, but doesn't really relate to the business problem.
You know, I want to pivot back to what you said. You know, I joined the conversation last night when you were a guest on the Nebraska AAF book club, book ad reads, and you were talking about your book. And I asked you last night what you left out, and you made the really great point that you've divided your career into thirds, and this is your first of possibly 3 books.
Yes.
So many of our viewers for the Brief Brothers are young brief writers, but they're also young creatives as well. But young brief writers who are figuring out how to become better brief writers. And it occurred to me that the way you and your partner negotiate and navigate your way through a brief comes from a lot of experience, having read a lot of briefs. And when a young person does that, who's kind of new to the brief process, and Henry can maybe speak to this, that they, a young person who's new to this may not have that kind of courage to speak up and say, I'm not quite sure that I think that this is working or something that to effect. So if you were addressing, and that's what this first book, Chew with Your Mind Open, is talking to, the younger creative, not necessarily a planner or a strategist, to a younger creative. But we are, and I wanted you to talk a bit about what advice would you give to creatives or planners who are breaking into the business to be more focused about questioning the brief?
Well, again, I think rule number one is don't complain to everybody but the guy who can do something about it. Go to the guy who can do something about it. And if you're respectful of the process, 9 times out of 10, they're going to respect you because they're going to realize you're struggling with the brief, and asking them to talk about it is the most decent way of dealing with it rather than trashing it, right?
Right.
Also, one of the things my dad used to always say to me is get outside of the agency. Get your nose out of the award books. If you're looking at award books, look at award books with a nose to try to figure out what the strategy was behind it. Because at least then as you look at this award-winning thing, like I love looking at work and trying to reverse engineer in my head what the brief said. So
that's a great exercise. I do that a lot.
When I saw Snickers, you're not yourself when you're hungry, I had nothing to do with that. I don't work at BBDO. I've never seen the brief. My guess at what the brief is, hey, people are really getting hip to the idea that sugar isn't good for them. Eating candy is not the greatest idea. Snickers sales are dipping. What can you do? And then what I think You're Not Yourself When You're Hungry does is pitch a candy bar as a meal replacement, which has got to be one of the greatest ideas I've ever seen. And that's the perfect example of if I give that turn line, and I call them turn lines, but if you give that to 100 creatives, 99 of them are going to come back with great work and the other team needs to be fired.
Yeah, I agree. And you look at that campaign and you think about, you're right. A candy bar fulfills different needs. It fulfills the need for self-reward, a need for something sweet. They talk about you're not yourself when you're hungry. Right. And what you eat when you're hungry isn't candy, you eat food. So they basically have taken a candy bar and made it into a food item. And so you're right. And we do that. That's the way that I teach my workshop is I have the participants look at, I have like a curated, like, I don't know, a dozen ads. They're probably like 10 years old at this point. They're mainly TV spots, but we look at them together and then we say, okay, write a target description for this. And I let them write it, I give them a couple minutes and then I go over like common pitfalls and then I read them like one that I wrote having spent some time for the same spot, not having any inside information, but to tell them this is the kind of narrative that you could write. This is the kind of target description. This is the kind of single-minded proposition that you might write. And it's a fun way of, and I also tell them, I see this a lot in our business is we work in advertising from 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock. And the second we get in the car and turn on the radio, we stop being advertising people. We're consumers. We don't like, I'm listening to the radio spots say, what are they saying? What was that? What was the tagline? Oh, that's a nice jingle. Watch a TV commercial. What are they really trying to tell me here? This is horrible, but why is it horrible? Right. What could the brief have been? What did the client approve here? Like, we don't look at advertising the same way like other professionals might look at their work outside of their work hours. Like my dad's a cosmetic surgeon. I can't imagine him going to the beach and not having a criticism for every woman who got a bad boob job or butt lift, right? Like we turn it off when we leave the office, and when we're out there looking at advertising, we should be looking at it with a critical eye of a practitioner.
Yep. Well, I don't know. I think because being raised by somebody who knew what I was getting myself into, I feel like I not only developed a love for creative, I developed a love for the craft and the discipline of thinking this stuff through. because there are certain campaigns that are done that everybody tells me are the greatest in the world, like Skittles, Taste the Rainbow, and I go, huh? then you say to me, Snickers, you're not yourself when you're hungry, and I go, thank you very much. You just gave me an excuse to eat a candy bar if I've skipped a meal.
Yeah, yeah. You know, we had Luke Sullivan on just last week, and he was tutored and to a certain extent mentored by Tom McElligott.
Yeah.
And I listened to a podcast that Dave Dye did with Tom McElligott, which was fascinating because he's kind of been hiding out. He's been a shy customer for the last many years. But Luke said that when he went to work for Tom McElligott at Fallon, the first thing he had him do was read. He said, "Here's my stack of CAs, award, the annuals, and the one shows and the things." And he said, "Go read these. Read everything in them, top to bottom, front to back. Read who did what on each campaign. Read everything, print, outdoor, TV, all of it." And he said, Tom said this was the equivalent of a graduate seminar in advertising to learn the business. And I was going to ask you about that because I was wondering, and you answered your question, you answered at least partially, which is when you answered just a moment ago, and you said, I'm more interested in the strategy. If I can study the award show books and figure out the strategy, that's going to be more beneficial to me than looking to those books for inspiration, which is what I did when I was, a young creative. I looked for inspiration.
Right?
Yeah.
I must have rewritten every Tom McElligott headline construct on earth. Like, think of it as da 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 da. Something's wrong when da 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 da. And I remember always like, well, where's my building award? I wrote it just like Tom McElligott.
Yeah, we talked about that. I think, and it's the same with any sort of artistic form, right? Like you at the beginning, you are absorbing a lot from other people, and sometimes you fall into the trap of copying a style or a mode from somebody who's very successful in that moment. But I think most artists, whether they be copywriters, stand-up comics, whatever, eventually come to a place where they find their own voice.
Yes.
And it's a compilation, it's a congregate of all of these influences, but it's a uniquely to that person voice. And I think that's true of brief writers as well. It takes practice. The best to become a brief writer. What I think improved my brief writing skills wasn't so much practice writing briefs, because the truth is, how many briefs do I write in a year? It's not that many. Like I do a lot of other things as a strategy head that are not related to writing briefs, but writing in general, because one of the things I say is brief writing is writing. You have an audience, you have to communicate something, and the better you are at writing, the better you're going to be a brief writer. So I used to write for fun, I used to blog, I used to do all these things, and I spent a lot of hours refining my writing skills that then translate into writing briefs.
Yep, and I think one of the interesting things to me is when you're first in the business, you're obsessed with winning awards. But all the things that you can write that they don't give awards for are the real keys to me. Strategy statements, mantras, mission statements, turn lines. Nobody gives awards for those, but that's the real magic. At least to me it is.
Well, isn't there an award out there named after your dad's partner for strategy?
Yes, the Jay Chiat awards for strategy.
And
does that include?
There are Effies as well, but I guess my point being, I shouldn't say that's not a coveted award, but I don't think I've ever met anybody who's won one and leads with that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Henry and I have talked about the fact that just like ads, creative briefs aren't signed by the brief writer. I mean, they're signed off on by people to approve them. But when we write an ad, when we write a direct mail piece, when we write a copy for a website or a TV spot, we don't sign the work.
Yeah.
It's we do it anonymously.
Well, I teach the people that I mentor in strategy to be humble. And I say great creatives will find a way to make great creativity, even with a crappy brief. So don't ever be so don't have so much hubris as to think that you're an indispensable part of the process. The analogy, and Howard's heard me say it a million times, is like a hitting coach on a Major League Baseball team, right? These guys are major leaguers. They can hit home runs. The job of the hitting coach is to find little things that might magnify the batting average by 10 points over the course of a season, which is a huge deal, right? Like if you can improve a batting average from, 275 to 285, that player is going to make many more millions of dollars the following year than the year that he did the 275. So you need to have a humble coach that knows what he's doing and a coachable player who recognizes the role of coaching. And so I think that that's the best of possible worlds, is when you have a strategy that's humble, but also creatives that are willing to take the coaching and to work together to improve that batting average.
And that was my secret weapon for the first 20 years of my career, is I could pick up the phone anytime and call my dad and go, listen to this pickle I've got myself into, or that I've been dragged into. And he'd always come in at 20,000 feet. He says, okay, first thing you need to do, remove the emotion. I don't care how it makes you feel. How are you going to solve it is the only thing you should be thinking about. There are the things you have the control over, there are the things you don't have the control over. Forget the things you don't have the control over. That's out of your control. If you just concentrate on the things you have control over and keep your head in the game and don't fall into the bitch bonding, I mean, I feel like a fair share of the success I've had is to still be going into the game on the third and fourth round when the smartest and best creatives in the building start hiding from the assignment. Right?
Yeah, I just read that chapter before we started. Yeah, that was really interesting. The ones who fold under pressure.
And
or they just couldn't be bothered, right?
I played competitive tennis as a kid, but I wasn't good enough to get a scholarship. I wasn't good enough to go pro, but I was just good enough that I understood that I could use intelligence to beat somebody better than me if I could find their flaw. And then right? So I see that in so many creative people, and oftentimes it's the people who have the most talent are the first to give up.
Yeah. I think because they're accustomed to success. Right. And when they face some headwinds, maybe they're like, you know what, screw this, let somebody else handle it. There was an interesting aspect of that chapter about briefs in your book, which was, and I think that this goes unsaid too much, which is sometimes you have to let the brief sit there in your mind before you start trying to ideate against it. Read it. And you advocate for really getting intimate with the brief. It's not just reading it once. It's get intimate with it. Question it in your own mind. Question it to the brief writer. Let it sink in there, because a lot of times the way our brain works in solving problems is passively. You can't force it, right? Like that's where writer's block happens, right? It's like you sit down and you say, now I'm going to read the brief and I'm going to come up with 3 ads. It doesn't work that way. It's like, I'm going to read the brief today. I'm going to read it again in the afternoon. I'm going to read it before I go to sleep. And tomorrow at some point, I'm going to come up with and usually the ideas start popping into your head when you're not actively thinking about it.
I have a pad next to me everywhere I go. If it's out in public, I got a small one in my back pocket. I am an advocate of reading the brief at night, right before you go to sleep, and putting the pad next to your table. My dirty little secret is mornings are everything to me. I can wake up at 5 a.m. and know my house will be completely quiet for at least 3 hours. And if I read the brief the night before, I'm waking up through the night going, what about this? What about this? And I'm just jotting it down. I'm not physically getting up. I'm forcing myself to stay in bed, but I put the ideas down. And a lot of people will tell you when they write down their ideas, they wake up the next morning and it's shit. That's not how it works for me.
At least it's a starting place, even if it is shit, right? It's a starting place, and that's why I think that word that Howard used earlier, organic, is really important, because the creative process is organic and it's give and take and it's iterative, right? One of the examples in terms of retooling the brief that I have from my own early in my career, or relatively early in my career, was I briefed on something happened to be for Burger King, as a matter of fact. This was like in 2008, and the creatives came back and they pitched their first round of ideas, and one of them had this idea that ultimately was never sold or executed. But when he explained the idea, I said, you know what, you have a really good insight into this assignment, and I want to amend the brief, and so ultimately an offshoot of that idea, a completely different scenario, was what got produced. But it only happened because they brought something to the table that stirred in me insecurity about what we were working with.
Right.
And I that's, again, I go back to being humble. It's like, I cannot afford to be dogmatic about a brief just because maybe the client approved the single-minded proposition, or because I wrote it and it was like the tablets that came down, to the mountain to Moses. That to me, there's no room for that kind of hubris. If my thinking somehow, for me, it's a win-win, because it somehow sparked an idea that sparked another idea. And so that organic, iterative nature of the creative process, to me, is what makes it fun and exciting.
Yeah. And I've always found that when I go and have conversations with the planner, I walk away from that conversation smarter. Or there could be something they didn't put into the brief because they wanted to keep it down to one page, and they go, well, if that support point speaks to you, here's a couple of other things I learned. I've had that be the thing so many times that I go, let me dig around with that. And then I'll go back and I'm fine.
But that gets back to the very thing we started with about a guess, right? So the brief writer made a guess as to what was most important, but somehow through the collaborative process, you uncovered that maybe there was something else, and then together you decided, yeah, maybe this is more important and should have been in the brief.
And I'm also a big believer, when I work with a partner, there's complete trust. I would never say to somebody, oh, that's a stupid idea. I'll go, okay, how do I flip that? And so many times hiding behind what seems like a really stupid idea is a brilliant one if you can just flip it to the other side and go, well, I'm not sure about that, but what if you do that, right?
Okay, I want to ask you another question about something in the book. I found this on page 120 under your tips for creating good work and a happy client. This one really struck me. You said, think of examples of questions that other creatives don't think to ask when you're in the room with a client.
Yep.
Do you have an example of an anecdote?
I mean, a lot of times nobody wants to admit they don't understand how it works. Well, how does that really work? I mean, I understand what it does, but how does it work? And I just think sometimes if you're willing to demonstrate you really want to understand it, like more than the average bear, oftentimes that allows, like I've gone back to the office and received an email from the client, said, since you asked, here's a couple links. And I mean, if it really interests you, knock yourself out. Then I always make it a point to read the links, because if I go back to the meeting the next time and said, that link you sent me kind of triggered an idea, I mean, in a way that's trickery, right? But I think
I had one of those examples recently. I have a bank client, and they're introducing a new policy that I think a lot of people are going to love, but I didn't understand how it worked in the background. And it's not important to the advertising per se, but it is important to convince myself that this is actually a good benefit that people are gonna draw something from. And so I asked that, I said, well, how does that really work in the background? Again, and with the caveat that it's not going to be in the advertising. The end benefit to the consumer doesn't rely on how it works in the background. But I think that being genuinely curious about the client's business is something that, frankly, a lot of people in advertising don't have.
Right, and this gets back to your relating the story which we talked about last night called the Capodastro bar.
Oh,
end. That's a great story. I went back and looked at the book that I sent you. I took it out of my third edition because I was rewriting the template that I used to teach how to write a brief. But in the first edition of my book, the Capodastro Bar story was highlighted, and briefly that tells the story of an intrepid copywriter who wanted to know more about the piano account that they just won, right. And he went to the plant.
The 2-day tour.
Yeah, the 2-day tour. Now my story was slightly different from yours. In the story that I came across, the copywriter found one of the oldest craftsmen in the back corner of the plant and asked him questions about what was so special about the piano. And he said, well, it's called the Capodastro Bar. And then he explained what that meant. He said, it isn't meant to do anything for the first 50 years of the piano. But when a certain piece of wood in the piano starts to warp, the Capodastro Bar goes to work and prevents it from warping, so that the piano maintains its lustrous sound for decades. And that's why the Metropolitan Museum, the Opera House, that's why they buy this particular branded piano. The point of the story is, if that copywriter hadn't dug and asked questions, he wouldn't have found the answer and the main copy point for the ad. So it's like, you gotta be curious, you gotta dig. Well, that's another thing I love about your book, Cameron, is that the curiosity and your work ethic just shines through in every chapter. It's wonderful.
It's funny because I think the first thing I'll tell you is I was an average student, and average is being
guilty,
generous.
Me too.
Right?
Guilty.
I'm generous when I say that. So I think my father understood my strengths and weaknesses, right? So I think when he looked at me, he said, if I can just get him to be disciplined, he'll be fine. Because I think he trusted creative, the instincts were there, but I was never much of a student. I was never much of a dig in. So he was always the guy, hey, go to where the product's being used. Sit in a chair and watch people use it. If you're struggling with a brief and you've talked to the planner, go sit in front of wherever the store is that it's being sold and watch people buying it, or listen to the conversations that are happening between real people.
Curiosity is really a strong suit for advertising people, particularly strategists and creatives. If you are interested in what people do and why they do it, and you go out there looking around for it, you're always going to be entertained because you're going to be surprised by the things that people do, but B, you're going to get insights into human behavior that then you can somehow reflect back in advertising. That the best advertising is the one that you see it and you go, man, that is so true, right? Like that. Right. It's like, or just like I always relate it back a lot of times to stand-up comedy. The best jokes are the ones that everybody's slapping their knee because they know that's exactly, they've had that thought before or had some form of that thought, and you can relate to it.
In a way, finding insights is a lot like observational comedy, right?
Yes.
You're not going to the dark stuff. You're not going to the dirty stuff. You're finding a really clean insight. There's a Stephen Wright gag that I just love. He said, I pull up to the 24-hour convenience store and the guy's locking a chain around the front doors. I walk up to him, I point at the sign, but it says open 24 hours. He looks at me and says, not in a row.
I love Stephen Wright.
How many times have we all looked at open 24 hours and not thought, hey, wouldn't it be funny if they'd only been open that many hours and it didn't mean what we think it means?
Yeah. These things that we all take for granted as that we all share the same interpretation, but could be open into many interpretations.
Right. Now, I think my dad, I can't help but talk so much about my dad because he just really put me onto the scent of how to be smart, how to be decent, about how to build bridges to the people outside the creative department. Like, I was always the guy, like, why are you going to lunch with that 70-year-old woman who works in media? And the answer is because I want to understand media a little better, right? And lo and behold, one of these days, I'm working on an assignment and I go, holy crap, what if we converted all of the money into outdoor? Could we even do that? And then I went to talk to my the lady in the media, she goes, that's a really interesting idea. And I worked at an agency where we took our TV budget, our radio budget, and we put everything on outdoor boards in Los Angeles. And we made the largest outdoor board buy up to that moment in time. Literally half of the outdoor boards in LA were outdoor boards for our client. And we ran no TV and we ran no radio. And there was a reason for this too. It was a recession. My client was a discounter and all of the major brands were racing towards fire sale. So we thought, oh my God, we're going to get our asses kicked. I mean, we inferior quality. We can't make our prices any lower than they already are. And all of a sudden, Nordstrom is selling women's T-shirts at the same price as ours. So what we did is we did a brand campaign that acted like it was a brand rather than a retail client, as all of the brands were acting like retail. And the funny thing that happened is we made this huge outdoor buy, and holiday sales went up 24% using only outdoor.
That's great.
And I remember the outdoor lady saying, I have been telling people my whole career that outdoor is a reminder medium. And you just fundamentally changed how I look at outdoor based on the results of this campaign.
Yeah, and I think that, it's a good lesson because creativity isn't just what you put on the paper or on the screen, right? There could be creative media choices. There could be, creative delivery choice, distribution choices. That there's a place for creativity. And to your point about building bridges to other departments, you can't offer that to a client unless you're having a conversation with a person that knows about distribution or the person that knows about media. And to take, one of the, before we had strategy at the first agency that I worked at, the guy that influenced me a lot was the media director, because they were the ones that owned the consumer data, and they were the ones, and he taught me like some very basic principles of strategy, because we didn't have a strategy department. So totally concur with that about building bridges to the other departments. And besides, I think that idea of this adversarial relationship between the account department and the creative department, it's destructive. It doesn't do anybody any good.
It's so funny because one of the things as I've got into leadership positions, I would kill so fast. Anybody who drops into that us versus them thing, it's like, listen, you're crazy if you think it's us versus them. This is not a battle against the account guy. This is a battle against mediocrity, and we're only going to win it if we get together on this, right? And it wasn't always a popular opinion, because a lot of creatives would go, you're not standing up for my work, and I'm saying because it's not that good.
So, and there's even a division within the creative department. The production side. I worked at Team One, and they had a collateral department back in the day when they were still producing 6 and 8 color brochures for all the models, which is now obviously done online. But they didn't want to share assignments. So there was a collateral department. I worked in the relationship marketing department. There was branding. And when my partner and I came up with an ad for a co-branded version of the top of the line, it was the LS400 at the time. Yep. I don't know what the model number is now, but they did, a coach version of the sedan.
Yeah.
So they opened it up to anybody in the creative department, collateral, relationship marketing, which Tom Cordner used to refer to as DREC marketing, by the way. He opened it up to everybody, and my partner and I came up with the ad that beat out the branding team, and they didn't like us very much for that.
Yep.
There was division even within the creative department.
Yeah.
Which is destructive.
It's funny too, because one of the other things my dad told me a long time ago, he said, find outcasts. Find people who don't fit into the boxes. Mm-hmm. Hire the guy who looks like the accountant but knows how to friggin' write. And if you support people who aren't used to being supported, they will be so loyal to you. They will stay up all night working for you. I mean, I've had so much luck taking that guy that nobody liked because he didn't look cool or didn't dress cool, and then all of a sudden he's doing the best writing in the whole department because he's got the talent he's so used to being pinned down by the body he's stuck in, or it's just so funny to me how genius can be right there in front of your eyes, and if it's not wearing the right shoes, so many people can overlook it.
Yeah. We're coming up on we've kept you here for a little over an hour, almost an hour. I want to address one other thing in your book that really struck me. I've never heard this before, but you seem to have made it work. It's your 70-30 rule.
Oh, yeah.
Where you agreed, you had a nice talk with the agency principal and said, look, we want to commit to doing 30% of our work is going to be quick turnaround. We're not going to sacrifice quality, but we're not going to really fall on our swords, I think was the line that you used. For about 30% of the projects that we are asked to do, we're going to get it out the door as quickly as we can so that the 70% of the work that we think really has creative opportunities will have the time to develop.
Right.
I mean, I don't know intimately what's going on in every agency on the planet, but that's a pretty foreign concept to me, and you made it work. Talk about that.
It's interesting because I have a friend who's a very good creative who read a draft of the book. And at the time, my 70-30 rule story was at the very end of my book as one of those little throwaway stories. And he called me up and he said, there's only one thing I'd change about your book. And I thought, uh-oh. And he goes, that 70-30 rule that you have on the second to the last page of your book, that needs to live in a chapter, man. That's gold. And it wasn't until he said that I realized, because it's so counter to that silly thing we're all trained that everything is an opportunity. And the trick to it is you need to be able to hit a double. And it's a lot easier to hit 3 doubles than it is to hit 1 home run. So I simply...
You also need to have a level of honesty,
right,
and trust, right, in an agency environment to pull that off, right? Because, some people are going to say, well, my project got short shrift or whatever. And the truth is you have to be honest and say, look, this is an assignment we got to do. There's probably nothing super creative going to come out of it. Let's do it. Let's do it to the best of our ability, but let's not delude ourselves into thinking this is the one that's going to take us to Cannes and get us all famous and get us bonuses and promotions.
Well, that wasn't an arbitrary decision just on my part. That was me sitting down with the head of account planning, with the head of accounts going, okay, here's what we're looking for in the week that's coming. Let's look at the briefs, go, I don't think that's an opportunity. She goes, yeah, you're probably right. But everybody bought into that. I mean, I had account people writing headlines that were, there it is, that's a double, thank you. And all of a sudden, they kind of left the building, go, I had a double for the creative director today, right? like they felt a sense of accomplishment. And I remember my writer at the time going, hey, she keeps writing headlines for me, and she can do these doubles all day long. And I said, well, let me take her to lunch, right?
And beyond writing it and getting the credit and feeling great for writing it, it also, I would imagine, takes a lot of the friction out, like, getting jobs out. If everybody agrees, hey, we got to do this job, it's going to be a hardworking ad, but it's not going to be like the thing that's going to go in anybody's book, except maybe the account person, right? But the account person is going to be happy because they're going to deliver it on time, without a lot of friction, without a lot of back and forth, and you get it out of the way, and you knock things out of the way, and then you can spare the bandwidth for the things that everybody's really excited about.
The best thing about the 70-30 rule that I didn't even see coming was when the client called up the account lady and said, I don't know what it is, but all of a sudden you guys are just being much more timely and receptive, and you've been a lot easier to work with. It's because sometimes we were giving them exactly what they want.
We stopped bullshitting ourselves,
right,
and trying to force gigantic ideas down their throat when it didn't require a gigantic idea.
And what ended up happening was that the work we spent more time on got really good. So I just think everybody realized, hey, we're getting along better. The opportunity work is really looking nice. And we're getting credit from the client for hitting the doubles because they go, suddenly you're not asking me for more time all the time. You're sending me 3 options, and I'm going, hell, I'll do any one of them. Which do you recommend? Well, let's do B. All right, B it is. You know, I mean, it's not rocket science, right?
Yeah.
But it's people skills and managing people, and that can often be harder, right? When you're dealing with rocket science, there's things that work and that don't work. And when you're dealing with people, the cast of characters, it changes at every agency, and even within agencies, it changes over time. So,
well, your point about the 70-30 rule is a good one. And yes, it was a small agency. And I also remember sitting down with a young writer I hired and explaining to him, when I ask you to do this and hit doubles, I'm telling you to do the best stuff, the best 3 things you can come up with in 20 minutes, and come show them to me. And if I don't like the 3 you have, I'll write the 3rd one. But you are not being judged if, oh, you only gave me doubles. I'm asking for doubles.
Yeah.
And
I think that's amazing advice coming from a creative.
Right.
Because it's creatives who usually object to that. So, that's one of the things I love about this book. And let's remind it's Chewing with Your Mind Open by Cameron Day. And Cameron, thank you so much for giving us this time and sharing your experience in the industry. I think we're all looking forward to book number 2, and again, maybe possibly book number 3.
Well, I'm chapters into book number 2 already.
That's great. That's great. Well, it's been a great read. I've still got about a third of it the way through, but we still produced a lot of questions and we had a great conversation. So, we loved having you here. Thank you so much for being part of the Brief Brothers.
Well, I wouldn't have had the career I've had if it wasn't for the briefs. So thank you.
Well said. Okay.
Thanks, gents.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Cameron. It's been wonderful. Thanks. Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach, and together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time. Bye-bye.